There are a handful of human beings alive right now who can hold their breath for over 10 minutes and dive 70 meters into the open ocean on a single lungful of air with nothing but a spear, a pair of wooden goggles, and weights tied around their waist. There are people who can sit half naked in the snow at altitude, wrapped in nothing but a thin sheet soaked in freezing water, and use their own body heat to dry it, over and over, through the night. There are populations who live and work at altitudes that would leave most of us gasping on a park bench, breathing air with a third less oxygen than sea level, as if it were nothing at all. For a long time, the easy explanation was that these were just tough people. Rugged lives make rugged bodies. But over the last 15 years, geneticists, physiologists, and immunologists have gone looking for the actual mechanism behind these abilities. And what they found doesn't read like folklore. It reads like biology quietly rewriting its own rulebook in 3 very different corners of the world, for 3 very different reasons. This is the real story. No invented interviews, no anonymous guests, no studio confessions. Just the documented, published, peer-reviewed science of what human bodies can apparently do when evolution or training pushes them to the edge. Off the coast of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines lives a population called the Bajo, sometimes known as the sea nomads. For more than 1,000 years, they have lived largely on houseboats, spending an extraordinary amount of their working lives underwater. Some estimates put it around 60% of a Bajo person's workday spent submerged, hunting fish and gathering shellfish along the seafloor. For comparison, that a work-in-water ratio that researchers say is closer to sea otters than any other human populations. In 2018, a geneticist named Melissa Lardo, then a doctoral candidate working with the University of Copenhagen, traveled to a Bajo community in Sulawesi to try to answer a question nobody had properly tested before. Was there something physically different about these divers, or was this simply a skill learned through a lifetime of practice? She used a portable ultrasound machine to measure the size of the spleen in dozens of Bajo divers and compared it to the spleens of their non-diving neighbors, an agricultural community called the Saluan. The spleen matters here because it plays a central role in what's known as the mammalian dive reflex. When the body is submerged, especially in cold water, the heart rate slows, blood vessels in the arms and legs constrict to protect the vital organs, and the spleen contracts, releasing a reserve of oxygen-rich red blood cells into circulation. It functions, in effect, like a biological scuba tank, giving the diver a little extra reserve of oxygen exactly when they need it most. What Alardo found was striking. The Bajo diver spleens were, on average, about 50% larger than those of their non-diving neighbors, a difference that held true even in Bajo individuals who didn't personally dive very often. That detail is the key. If the size difference were purely the product of training and repeated diving, you'd expect it to show up only in active divers. Instead, it looked baked in. When Alardo and her colleagues sequenced DNA from both communities and compared it to a large reference dataset, they found a set of genetic variants that stood out in the Bajo, including one in a gene called PDE10A, which appears to regulate thyroid hormone levels. Thyroid hormone, in turn, has been linked in animal studies to spleen size. Mice bred without a key thyroid hormone develop noticeably smaller spleens, and the effect can be reversed with a hormone injection. The working hypothesis, published by Alardo and her team in the journal Cell, is that natural selection over many generations has nudged the Bajo toward a genetic profile that produces a larger spleen, and a larger spleen means a bigger built-in oxygen reserved for every dive. This was the first time researchers had tracked a genetic adaptation to breath-hold diving in any human population. It's not mysticism, and it's not a trick of training. It's natural selection, operating over centuries, on a trait that happens to make the difference between an average diver and someone who can plunge dozens of meters down and stay there for minutes at a time, seemingly unbothered. Roughly 4,000 meters above sea level, on the Tibetan plateau, oxygen is scarce enough that lowlanders who travel there often develop altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, shortness of breath, and in severe cases, dangerous swelling in the brain or lungs. Tibetans, by contrast, have lived and worked at that altitude for thousands of years without those same struggles, and researchers have spent the last 2 decades trying to understand exactly why. The leading explanation centers on a gene called EPS1, sometimes nicknamed the superathlete gene, which helps regulate how the body responds to low oxygen, including how much hemoglobin it produces. Lowlanders who travel to high altitude for an extended period typically respond by producing more hemoglobin, thickening the blood to carry more oxygen. That sounds useful, but over the long term it comes with a cost. Thicker blood is harder to pump, raises blood pressure, and increases the risk of dangerous clotting and heart strain. Tibetans carry a variant of EPS1 that does something different. Instead of driving hemoglobin sky high, it keeps it closer to sea level norms even at extreme altitude, while other physiological adjustments help the body use the oxygen that is available more efficiently. The net effect is a population that isn't fighting its own blood chemistry just to survive at altitudes that would send most bodies into crisis. What makes this variant especially interesting is where it likely came from. Genetic comparisons have found that the high-altitude version of EPS1 in Tibetans closely resembles a version found in the genome of Denisovans, an extinct relative of modern humans known mostly from a handful of fossil fragments found in a Siberian cave. The leading theory is that early modern humans interbred with Denisovans, picked up this beneficial variant, and it was subsequently favored by natural selection in populations that settled the Tibetan plateau because it made survival at extreme altitude dramatically easier. It's a genetic adaptation borrowed from a different branch of the human family tree entirely, and passed down for tens of thousands of years because it worked. Similar but genetically distinct high-altitude adaptations have also been documented in other populations, including Andean communities in South America and groups in the Ethiopian highlands, though the specific mechanisms differ between them. Each population appears to have arrived at its own biological solution to the same basic problem: how to thrive where there isn't enough air. The third piece of this story doesn't come from a genetically isolated population at all. It comes from a single individual and a group of Dutch scientists who initially set out to prove him wrong. Wim Hof, a Dutch extreme athlete known for feats like swimming under ice and climbing partway up Mount Everest in shorts, had long claimed that through a combination of breathing exercises, meditation, and gradual cold exposure, he could consciously influence processes in his body that were soon to be entirely automatic: his autonomic nervous system and his innate immune response. That's a big claim, because for most of modern medical history, the autonomic nervous system was considered exactly what its name suggests: automatic, outside of voluntary control. In 2011, researchers at Radboud University Medical Center in the Netherlands decided to test it directly. They injected Hof with a small, carefully controlled dose of endotoxin, a component of bacterial cell walls that reliably triggers a strong immune response in humans, typically producing flu-like symptoms such as fever, chills, and headache. Hof was asked to practice his breathing and concentration technique during the exposure. Researcher Peter Pickers, who led the work, reported that Hof's inflammatory markers came in at roughly half the level typically seen in people given the same endotoxin dose, and that he experienced almost none of the usual flu-like symptoms. A single data point isn't science, though, so the team designed a proper follow-up study, published in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This time, 12 ordinary volunteers with no prior experience were trained in Hof's method for just 10 days. Breathing exercises, meditation, and exposure cold, including time in ice water. 12 other volunteers received no training at all. Both groups were then given the same endotoxin injection. The results surprised the immunology community. The trained group was able to voluntarily spike their adrenaline to levels higher than those typically measured in first-time bungee jumpers, and this surge appeared to trigger the release of anti-inflammatory signaling molecules that blunted the immune system's overreaction. Compared to the untrained controls, the trained volunteers showed significantly lower levels of pro-inflammatory markers, including interleukin-6, interleukin-8, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, along with milder and fewer flu-like symptoms overall. It's worth being precise about what the study did and didn't show. It did not prove the method cures autoimmune disease, prevents illness, or replaces medical treatment, and researchers involved in the work have been careful to say so. What it did show, convincingly published and replicated, was that ordinary people with no special genetic background and only 10 days of practice could learn to consciously influence a part of their physiology that textbooks had spent decades describing as involuntary. Later follow-up studies from the same research group explored how expectation and training interact, adding nuance without undoing the core finding. It would be tempting to lump the Bajau, Tibetans, and Wim Hof's cold training volunteers together into one tidy message. Humans are secretly superhuman, and modern life has made us soft. But the honest version of the story is more interesting than that, precisely because these are 3 different mechanisms doing 3 different jobs. The Bajau's advantage looks to be substantially genetic, the product of many generations of natural selection acting on a population that has spent centuries diving for a living. It isn't something a non-Bajau person can simply train their way into overnight, though training does still matter. Competitive breath hold divers without the genetic background can still push their limits significantly through practice. The Tibetan adaptation is also genetic, but arrived through an entirely different route, an ancient variant, likely inherited from interbreeding with Denisovans tens of thousands of years ago, that happened to make survival at extreme altitude dramatically easier and was subsequently favored generation after generation. The Wim Hof findings are different again, because they were demonstrated in ordinary volunteers with no unusual genetic background, using a technique that could be taught in a matter of days. That's precisely what made the 2014 study so noteworthy to physiologists. It wasn't describing an isolated population's inherited trait. It was describing a trainable skill that appears to give any healthy person some voluntary influence over processes long assumed to be automatic. What ties them together isn't a single hidden law of physics being broken. Physics isn't being violated at all. None of this is magic, and none of it lets anyone escape the basic constraint of biology. What's being demonstrated in three very different ways is how wide the range of normal human physiology actually is, and how much of what we assume are hard limits are really just the limits of untrained, unadapted, average bodies living average modern lives. There's a reason findings like these tend to travel widely once people hear about them. It isn't because they promise magic. It's because they quietly challenge an assumption most of us carry around without examining it, that the version of normal we experience, sitting in climate control rooms, breathing sea-level air, rarely asking our cardiovascular or immune systems to do anything difficult, represents something close to the ceiling of what a human body can do. The Bijou showed that a population that spends generations demanding something specific and extreme of the body, extended breath holding under real pressure, over and over for 1,000 years, can end up with a measurably different physiology as a result. The Tibetans show that a population facing an entirely different extreme, chronic low oxygen at altitude, can carry a genetic solution inherited from completely different, long-extinct human lineage. And the Wim Hof research shows that even without any of that generational pressure, a person's autonomic nervous system and immune response aren't as fixed and involuntary as 20th century medicine assumed. That with the right training, in as little as 10 days, an ordinary volunteer can measurably change how their own body responds to a genuine biological challenge. None of this is a call to abandon modern medicine, move to a mountain, or take up breath-hold diving without training and supervision. All three of these adaptations exist within real physiological limits, and pushing past those limits carelessly, especially with cold exposure or breath holding, carries genuine risk and has caused real injuries in people who try to replicate extreme feats without preparation. But it is a reminder worth sitting with. The line between impossible and just untrained is a lot blurrier than most of us assume, and in at least a few documented, published, peer-reviewed corners of human biology, people have already shown exactly where that line actually sits, and is further out than the one most of us have quietly agreed to stop pushing against. Sources reference: Alardo et al., Physiological and Genetic Adaptations to Diving and Sea Nomads, Cell, 2018, University of California, Berkeley and University of Copenhagen research summaries on the Bijou spleen study, published genetics research on the EPS1 variant in Tibetan populations and its Denisovan origin, Cox et al., Voluntary Activation of the Sympathetic Nervous System and Attenuation of the Innate Immune Response in Humans, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 2014. Radboud University Medical Center research summaries on the 2011 and 2014